On behalf of the entire New College community, the New College Lectures Trustees, New College Board and staff, approximately 170 collegians living here at New College in this COVID-affected year, and approximately 90 collegians presently residing at New College Postgraduate Village across the road, and our 7,000 alumni, may I begin by warmly welcoming everyone who is joining us this evening. As we pause and consider the future of Australian society over the next 3 nights, it is also important that we pause and acknowledge the long history of the Bedigal people who are the traditional custodians of this land. So on behalf of us all, we'd like to pay our respects to their elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present with us here today. We live on the cusp of strange times. Sydney is presently approaching 70% vaccination, and promise of freedom lies before us. Last year, Professor Patrick Parkinson presented the New College lectures via teleconference as he was unable to travel between Queensland and New South Wales. In spite of the complications, it was an extremely useful and thought-provoking set of lectures. Indeed, I quoted Patrick in an email to someone just this last week. This second COVID year has turned our minds to the health and safety of those that we love in a very focused way. Within our colleges specifically, several people have lost close family members. Some have had to return home to care for grief-stricken families and not been able to return. We pause during this very difficult year to consider what I rank as the most important issue of the emerging generation, and we do this courtesy of our distinguished lecturer. Very few have actually been able to join us here at New College this evening due to the restrictions, but there are many, many others joining us via Facebook livestream. And then, as well, there are those that will hear summaries of this material in the broadcast media. At this point, I should acknowledge my fellow New College Lecture Trustees, the Right Reverend Dr. Michael Stead, Bishop of South Sydney, and Professor David Cohen, President of the UNSW Academic Board. I wish to acknowledge distinguished guests also who are joining us via live stream this evening, former Master of New College, the Reverend Dr. Bruce Kay and Dr. Louise Kay. We have representatives of the present and former New College boards, Mrs. Jan Simpson, the present New College Board Chair, and her husband, Reverend Dr. Ken Simpson, Ms. Jane Pangaculum, Mr. Stephen Hodgkinson and Mrs. Margaret Hodgkinson, former Board Chair, Reverend Dr. Robert Doyle and Mrs. Rosalind Doyle, Emeritus Professor Christine Alexander, also a former Lectures Trustee, Dr. Louis Chubb and Dr. Peter Chubb, Mrs. Elizabeth George and Mr. Tim George. We have many distinguished visitors joining us this evening. The Reverend Stuart Adamson, Associate Dean at Morling College, Professor Eileen Baldry, who is Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion here at UNSW, Ms. Barbara Bolt, Senior Program Manager at Anglicare, Mr. Michael Ataya, Head of St Bishoy College, Associate Professor Megan Best of the University of Notre Dame, the Reverend Mike Dicker, Principal of YouthWorks College, Ms. Geraldine Doog, renowned Australian journalist and broadcaster, and the Reverend Dr. Andrew Ford, General Manager of Mission and Partnerships for Anglicare, Reverend Paul Grimman, Dean of Students at Moore Theological College, Mr. James Honour, Principal of St George Christian School, Emeritus Professor Michael Lawrence here at UNSW and his wife, Mrs. Sarah Lawrence, long-standing supporters of the New College Lectures, Ms. Catherine Lawney, the New South Wales Mental Health Commissioner, Professor Melanie Lovell from Hammond Care, and Dr. Natasha Moore from the Centre for Public Christianity. Professor Paul Oslington at Alpha Crucis College, Reverend Dr. Kirk Paxton of Sydney Missionary Bible College, Reverend Craig Roberts, who's the CEO at YouthWorks, Briony Scott, Principal at Winona, Mrs. Tara Stenhouse, Dean of Women at Moore Theological College, Dr. Peter Stiles of Excelsior College, and Associate Professor Lisa Williams of Psychology here at UNSW. We received apologies from the Honourable David Coleman MP, who's the Assistant Minister of the Prime Minister for Mental Health and Suicide Prevention, and Georgie Harmer, CEO of Beyond Blue. They will be provided with access to our lectures recordings. Some very brief words for those that are not familiar with the new colleges and the new college lectures. New college communities comprise 2 residential colleges on the campus of the University of New South Wales, one of the most highly ranked universities internationally. New College is now in its 53rd year and is home to 247 undergraduate students and has an impressive history of graduates who have achieved first in their degree and a much, much greater number who've gone on to be leaders in their fields. New College Postgraduate Village is home to 315 postgraduate and senior undergraduate students. Now in its 13th year, it's already produced 100 doctorates at the University of New South Wales. Again, a community that's producing more and more international leaders each year. Both colleges enjoy a national reputation for their caring environments, their vibrant communities, and their academic accomplishments. 3 core aspects of college which we value and cultivate with the student leadership teams to best and support those who live with us. Indeed, my view is that safe and supportive university environments inspire each member to contribute to community life and pursue excellence in their own academic studies. The New College lectures are a very important feature of our annual calendar of events. They reflect our college's aspirations to contribute to the national conversation around key issues affecting our society and our futures. They draw on excellent research, scholarship and empirical knowledge from a position of faith to stimulate discussion both in the broader community and amongst our residential communities, those who will become our leaders of the future. This is the 35th year of the New College Lectures, one of the most long-standing and nationally recognised lecture series in Australia, which have attracted leading thinkers from across the globe. Full details of previous series and publications are available on our website. This year, we've invited one of our own. There are many voices in the mental health space, but the lectures trustees were inspired by Dr. Brown's intimate knowledge of the Australian landscape. As head of these colleges, I interact with many people daily. Dr. Brown's views on the importance of the individual in their social context resonated with my personal experience in the engineering industry, our university, in social welfare, and of course within these terrific communities here at UNSW. The first lecture is of special significance to the New College communities. The senior staff continue to innovate with our student leadership teams on how the entire community can best and support and care for the individuals who live with us. Over the coming 2 nights, we'll spend time thinking about mental health and nurture in family and community contexts, but we all have our secret voices. As we gather this evening, I hope it'll be an opportunity for each person listening to reflect on their personal journey and their individual experience. It may also be an opportunity for us to reflect on the individuals around us. Now, questions. We love questions at the New College Lectures. It sets us apart from many other lecture series. Anyone gets to ask the lecturer questions, and we'll do our best to get through them all. After or during the lecture, it's just so easy. Even though we are so far from each other. So please go to the Slido website. It's dead easy. 6 letters, sli.do. Type that in and abracadabra, up will come the website. Then type in the 7-letter hashtag NCL2021, uppercase, lowercase, doesn't matter. There are instructions on the screen here, and they were circulated in an email that you would have received prior to lectures. Housekeeping, we don't need to worry about housekeeping this year. If you hear fire alarms, please exit your residence in a safe and orderly manner, wherever you might be. And I assume you know where your bathroom is, so I don't need to explain that from here. New College and New College Postgraduate Village are Anglican colleges here at UNSW. If you don't mind, I'll dedicate this time to God in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, as we meet here this evening, we thank you for the freedom we have in this country to discuss crucial matters of life and love without fear. We ask for your blessing now upon our lecturer this evening, that you would give her clarity of thought and expression. Please grant to us all knowledge of you and a better understanding of you and your ways in this world. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. It is now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Jenny Brown to address us. Dr. Brown is Director Emeritus at the Family Systems Institute here in Sydney. The Family Systems Institute provides training and clinical services in Bowen's family systems and has done so since 2004. Dr. Brown herself has over 35 years clinical experience. Her primary clinical and research interest has been in family and mental health. In 2018, she received the Australian and New Zealand Family Therapy Journal Award for her distinguished contributions to the field. In 2012, she authored the book Growing Yourself Up. Last year, she released Confident Parenting. She continues to publish extensively. She was awarded her doctorate by the University of New South Wales in 2017. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you very much, Adjunct Professor and College Master Bill Pearson. And I want to start by commending all of the audience online tonight. In the midst of COVID lockdown, if you're like me, the last thing I want to do at the end of a day sitting on Zoom meetings is to attend another online meeting. So for you to be here with us this evening with lockdown fatigue, online fatigue, that truly tells me that this issue is of real, genuine concern for all of you out there. In thinking about nurturing and mental health, confronting a crisis, I do want to acknowledge that this is a broad and a complex issue, and it's deeply personal. I don't think there's a family, a broader extended family, or a workplace, or indeed, as we've heard, in a college community, in a university, higher education setting, that hasn't been touched in deep and many painful ways by the impacts of mental illness. I speak tonight not as a full-time academic, but predominantly as a clinician. And I have some unique vantage points that I hope I can bring to the lecture as a supervisor in the field, a trainer of people who are already qualified, their professional development. And a lot of my supervision is also with managers of frontline mental health services. And I speak as a late career doctoral researcher, as has already been mentioned at this fine institution and the Department of Social Science. My effort in this lecture series is to open up curiosity about what kind of help helps. What sort of nurture promotes a person's and a group's growth and learning for life? I'll be asking these questions, and I invite you to really think along with me and ask yourself these questions. First of all, is there truly a mental health crisis? Our current systems cannot meet the ever-growing demand for mental health care and services, but is this stigma being removed, more services available? They're worthy questions. And for me, as I'm preparing this lecture series, I'm asking, is there more to this than not enough treatment services, which is the current landscape? Huge waiting lists for people to get in to see mental health professionals. Is the nurture on offer promoting or somehow inadvertently impeding growth and development of humans in their struggles? And are there other sources of nurture out there that are not being attended to sufficiently in family and community? Do those questions sound relevant to you? I hope so. I do want to give a caveat, a really important caveat. I'm questioning treatment services and treatment efficacy, and I'll present some research on that. But I'm not in any way wanting to minimize the debilitating effects of mental unwellness for people, for many sufferers. I'm also not disregarding the knowledge and dedication of practitioners in the field who I value as colleagues and empathize with the complex demands of providing service. What is nurture? It's not a word we hear too often these days. Looking up the Oxford Dictionary, it tells me that nurturing somebody or something is for care and protection while they are growing and developing. I want to emphasize while they are growing and developing. I also looked up the King James Version dictionary. Nurture is a word that appears quite a bit in that version of the Bible, less in our modern versions. And the definitions are as a noun, that which nourishes. It's a lovely word, that which nourishes with food and diet, and that which promotes growth, education, and instruction. As a verb, it's to feed and to nourish, and to educate and to bring up and train. So again, hold this in mind as we think through these questions tonight, promoting growth in development and promoting learning. An overview of what I'm going to cover. It's quite a dense lecture, this first one. I'm going to cover the data on mental health in Australia and in the pandemic, and a little bit of the global stats on that as well. I do aim to open up fresh consideration of mainstream treatment offerings. I will review the historical context over the last century of mental health treatment trends. Really interesting. And I want to consider, as I've already said, the kinds of help that are out there. What kinds of help truly nurture? And my definition of this, it's come out of research, it's come out of literature, and my experience is nurture that promotes agency and resilience as opposed to passivity or helplessness. And there's a lot of helplessness out there, not just from those who are struggling with receiving mental health treatment, but family members trying to navigate the service system and find help for the people they care about. I need to declare my theoretical bias, which has already been mentioned in the introduction. Murray Bowen, Dr. Murray Bowen, the psychiatrist, there should be a slide coming up soon that just gives you an overview of Dr. Murray Bowen's theory, which is a theory that I was introduced to in the 1990s studying in the New York area. And when I came across this theory, it opened up my eyes of understanding the families that I was working with clinically and indeed my own family. I want to highlight that Dr. Murray Bowen was a significant researcher more than a clinician in the field of psychiatry and mental health. He had a very prestigious research grant from the National Institute of Mental Health in the late 1950s and did most unique research that, having been through ethics procedures with Department of Health, they never would have gotten through today, but he had admitted whole families for up to a year, observing them in situ with a seriously unwell adult young person who was a member of that family. And out of that theory, you can see from this summary, there are a few key things that really influence my thinking about the field of mental health and human flourishing. Relationships are central. Tonight we're talking about nurturing the individual. Individuals are part of relationships. It's obvious, but it's often missed in research and treatment. And relationships are central. They're a force for nurture, but they can also impede people's growth. And Bowen talked about his observations about how that can happen in families and indeed communities and workplaces. His theory talks about a continuum of sensitivities that every human has in their relationships, and a continuum of capacity to manage stress and anxiety. His theory also focuses on symptoms belonging to the family, not just the individual. I'm going to turn now to a clinical case, go back to my roots in sitting with people struggling and lending a hand to them. I'm going to give you a case example. It's a de-identified case example. I'm calling this the story of Karen. Karen is a composite of many people who have presented at my practice over the years. And I want to introduce you to her efforts to find nurture in the face of some really challenging mental health issues and a history of adversity and trauma. When I met Karen, she had already had years of intensive individual therapy. She'd been through visiting a number of psychiatrists who had consulted with her, prescribed medications. She had a history of childhood abuse within her family. She had a competent persona in her workplace. However, her functioning in her private world was seriously compromised. Her symptoms were self-harming. Keeping that secret was a real challenge for her in her workplace. Episodes of depression, not being able to get out of bed on the weekends, and real struggles with losing her cool with family members, being very protective of her children who were also experiencing mental health symptoms, particularly anxiety symptoms. Karen had burnt out previous doctors and counsellors, she declared to me. After a few years of seeing psychotherapists or psychiatrists, they would refer her on to another expert for review of diagnosis, medication, and a different treatment approach. My work with Karen, I don't have a fairy tale story with Karen because it's not like that in mental health. My work with Karen was grounded in Bowen's theory. At its core, it's seeing that every individual grows resilience by working to manage themselves less reactively in their real-life relationships. My posture, my effort with my posture in counselling is to sit side by side, not expert and helpless patient. And I'm going to return to Karen's story at the end of this lecture. But why am I sharing this at the beginning of this lecture tonight? Well, I'm inviting you all to consider the alternate versions of treatment and nurture out there. I'll give 3 alternatives, but I am noting that any treatment is probably going to sit in between or on a continuum between all of these. But in brief, here they are. First of all, going to a mental health expert who diagnoses, prescribes, and follows a short-term treatment protocol. Evidence-based is a key in the field. The second is longer-term psychotherapy that seeks to heal symptoms and the effects of past adversity. The longer-term psychotherapy is a nurture that focuses on the transference of the relationship between the client and the expert healer. The treatment space provides distance, a safe, secure place away from the stress of real-life relationships. I want you to think about that. The pluses of that, taking you out of the stresses, and the costs of that, of not learning to deal with those stresses. And often in this kind of treatment, which is pervasive out there, there are labels that are given to previous caregivers that are labels such as toxic parents or caregivers, and they're seen as causal of current problems. Alternatively, the work that I'm presenting with Karen as a case example is a personal journey of research with a collaborator. And with this, there's a searching together for clues of ways to manage self more steadily in important relationship domains. The lens goes much broader than biology, but doesn't discount biology or temperament or genetics. It looks for available sources of nurtures and growth in the person's real life. An exploration of complex multi-generational family history might be one part of this work, so that a person can see themselves not as a victim, but as someone who can better come to understand their past. Essentially, it's a work of growing self up in a gentle, paced way. Now, you've already heard my bias come through in how I presented the third alternative, but as you think of those alternatives, how do you think they would impact a person's growth and development? How do you think those different pathways have different consequences for someone like Karen and for their growth and for their learning? Okay. Stepping away from a personal case, we're going to go broad now. The current state of mental health in Australia and globally. Is there truly a crisis, or just less stigma, more openness to access help, more help available? And when you open up new services and publicise them, people come. Is that what's going on? Well, certainly, there's so much data out there, but looking at pre-pandemic data, 2007 to 2017 from WHO, World Health Organization, there certainly are indications of a crisis that go beyond other hypotheses or explanations. 13% rise in mental health conditions and substance use disorders in the last decade up to 2017. And particularly concerning in the field that I'm most involved in, around 20% of the world's children and adolescents have a mental health condition, with suicide the second leading cause of death among 15 to 29-year-olds. I want to give you a couple of visual snapshots of the mental health situation. This slide comes from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, who do a really comprehensive Australian-wide survey of mental health and well-being and summarise it every 12 years. This data comes from 2008, and the next one will be released in December this year. Won't it be interesting to look at the comparison statistics? But the trends are the same. There's no major shift in the presentation of mental health issues. Number one, anxiety disorders. Number two, affective disorders, various types of depression. Number three, substance use disorder. And note in this slide the very interesting and perplexing gender differences of male and female. Also, there are variations across age groups that are interesting in considering this context tonight. The younger age groups, they appear in more than a quarter of their population, and similar right up to age 34, 25% of people aged 25 to 34 present with mental health symptoms within a period of a 12-month period in the broad stats. And this compares with 5.9% of those aged between 75 and 85. Interesting. Even though there is a lot more attention to aged care mental health coming through, I wonder if that will increase the stats, the available services. These are the kind of questions raised. What about the impact of COVID-19 and this pandemic? I'm sure you've all heard that it's often referred to as the shadow pandemic, the mental health crisis, and the domestic violence, the interpersonal violence crisis. What then is the effect of this global pandemic with its multiple societal, family, and individual stressors? In looking at a host of papers, most of them being published up to the end of 2020, although there are recent surveys but not peer-reviewed papers yet, It's very clear, and I'm almost stating the obvious, but it's worth putting out there, that the pooled prevalence of mental health problems during the pandemic is higher than before the outbreak, but not particularly straightforward, and very, very clear that a lot of these issues were already present. The vulnerabilities were there, the trends were there, and what we're seeing is an amplifying of the vulnerabilities there. You may have heard these puzzling statistics that to date, even though there's a rise in the use of mental health services, an increase in psychological distress, there isn't yet evidence of an associated population-based rise in suspected deaths by suicide. That is not the case, however, amongst adolescents and young people, and I'll be talking more about that in tomorrow's lecture. But it's also useful to highlight that the pandemic is not impacting all parts of the population in the same way. Who are the most vulnerable out there? The studies coming through show that the most vulnerable demographics are being female and being younger, but you see that fits the trend pre-pandemic. Studies in Europe, studies in Australia are showing the most negative impact on young people, on women, as I've said, and those living with young children. Completely logical. Studies in interpersonal violence, marital breakdown during the pandemic, on the whole, they are acknowledging that there were underlying vulnerabilities, and these have been intensified and amplified during a pandemic. So intensity, the pressure cooker of intense relationships when there are already vulnerabilities, is an important piece to consider in the mental health realm. Looking at a recent Australian study from the Medical Journal of Australia in October last year, and I have a slide for this one just to give you a little bit more of a picture of what's going on during the pandemic. You can see in a survey of almost 14,000 respondents that depression was the highest, followed by anxiety. 14.6% of respondents did have thoughts of self-harm on some days. And I've put there in green because I think this is the one that many of us can relate to, that 59% of the population report being more irritable during the pandemic. Can you relate to that one? I think that's really important because it shows the humanity and the broad spectrum and the continuum of mental health struggles rather than just diagnostic categories. And look at the yellow, bright, sunny box here. More than those who reported incidents of depression and anxiety, a greater percentage reported an increase in optimism about the future. So there are many interesting variables to consider here. What are the protective factors that mitigate the impact of the pandemic? I've already mentioned that vulnerabilities prior to lockdown and the stresses and the anxieties around health and well-being, they are vulnerabilities that increase susceptibility to mental health conditions, but the protective factors that are covered by the literature are having a pre-COVID positive home environment, that this is the key protective factor for having an adaptive experience during the pandemic. There are recent surveys, not yet published papers, of Australians. There's one recently of 1,000 people that found that 70% of participants reported having experienced at least one positive effect of the pandemic. Can you think of one for yourself? There were 3 main positive effects: having the opportunities to spend more time with family, having greater flexibility in working arrangements, and appreciating having a less busy life. Take commute time out of it. I think there are clues from these positive factors of what is central to human well-being and nurture. Connection with family, community, and nature, really significant for this. I have, in preparation for these lectures, written to some of my senior colleagues out there, senior psychiatrists working in hospitals in the mental health field. I'm going to include their reports, particularly in my lecture tomorrow on children and families. But I want to give you a snapshot of what they're telling me. It's very interesting. Acuity is up, self-harm emergency presentations are up, particularly for young people. And these presentations in emergency are crossing all the socio-economic parts of Sydney. So the two children's hospitals, for example, Westmead, Randwick, same number of presentations. Very interesting. What I'm hearing from psychiatrists and representing their colleagues in the front line of mental health is anxiety is really high. And I'm not talking here about the patients, I'm talking about the workers. Workers' satisfaction is low and getting lower because they're not seeing results from their work, repeat acute presentations to emergency. And yet much of the treatment that is currently being funded and targeted, and I know there's a lot more out there ready to be presented, it's going to emergency presentations. Is this ideal ground for doing our best at nurture in the mental health climate? Okay, back to considering nurture in mental health approaches. Current treatment trends, let's have a look at them together. And this first slide that you can see from the data in the Department of Health websites is showing 10 years of mental health expenditure. It's a visual picture of the growth. Just take a look at the patterns and the colours, and this particularly applies to public health services and NGOs, non-government organisations, who are increasingly getting more of the services that they have to put in grants for and compete to get, and they have short cycles of security in delivering those services. So I could talk more, but I won't tonight. But I just want to flag there's a lot of anxiety out there in the services trying to hold on to their funding. But the outstanding growth is in the acute care, psychiatric units, and in community services. And of course, these are the more expensive areas to fund. The next slide moves into the area of Medicare services. And Medicare services, many of you would know, were expanded substantially in 2007 to include better access to mental health care. And what this slide shows is, I think, really interesting, that the number of people receiving Medicare subsidised mental health services increased from 1.4 million in 2009-2010 to 2.7 million by 2019. It's double. That's huge. This is pre-pandemic. There is a huge increase in the number of professionals. Psychiatrists increased by over 8%, mental health nurses by over 7%, psychologists by over 8.9%. But have a look at the line, the orange line there. Look at the general practitioners and the growth in delivery of mental health from general practitioner, primary level mental health care. It is the most common treatment in the field is with a GP. And what's the main treatment offered from GPs? In the data that I'm quoting from, over 61% of GP encounters out of 100 presentations, scripts were written, predominantly for antidepressants. I think that's a significant piece to consider in asking about the kind of nurture on offer. Again, I don't want to downgrade the benefits that many people have from medications. But when you look at how much people are receiving short consults with doctors and medications, they may get referrals to psychologists or allied health Medicare providers like myself, but not follow through on them, although many do. But you can see from the stats, it's predominantly a visit to the doctor in mental health under Medicare at this point. There's a lot of symptom reduction being on offered, but how does this fit the definition of nurture that we're working with tonight? How does this fit with growth in development and growth in learning about self in a challenging world? So, having outlined the trends in mental health conditions and treatment, I wonder what questions are being raised for you about our approaches to nurturing emotional well-being. Just pause and think about the questions that you're becoming more curious about with this topic tonight. So now I'm going to take a historical tour, broaden the lens. We started with the story of Karen, just one personal story. Now we've looked at the broader stats in the here and now or the last 10 years. Now I'm going to look at the historical tour of mental health over a century plus. How did we get to where we are? I'm not a historian, but I do find the history absolutely engaging to broadly look at what are the trends, how have we gotten there. Looking at one paper published in 2011 that covered 100 years of mental health, here are the key things that stand out. In the early 19th century, you've predominantly got mental health care just treating psychosis in asylums, and that was mental health delivery. Counselling was the domain of teachers and clergy, and it was called character therapy or moral character therapy. Interesting. Into the 20th century, you do have treatment of patients with the milder neuroses and personality difficulties, and this is the beginning of talk therapy. It's not that long ago. And professions, and of course this is the era of Freud and company, the talking treatments. The mental hygiene movement, have you heard of that? It was a big movement in the early 20th century, and it was when medicine started to broaden itself beyond physical illness to psychosocial issues. So the beginnings of medicalizing the field. There has been a significant increase, I've already told you about it in the last 10 years, but in the last century of mental health being professionalized and the growth of the professions in this field. There was a big jump in the 1960s. In the US, this was heralded by JFK around the impacts of coming out of Cold War and Vietnam looming, and he provided funding for community mental health centers, which was a big growth industry that spread around the Western world and other parts of the world. I remember my first placement in a community mental health center back in about 1979, I think. From the late 1950s, this is a really key juncture in the history of mental health. Effective antipsychotic medications came into play. They were around earlier, but effective ones, beginning with chlorpromazine in 1956, an antipsychotic that meant that large psychiatric hospitals could be closed and there could be expansion into the community sector. And I could go on with the more recent trends. There's little tiny blips of family therapy coming onto the horizon. Sadly, it hasn't ever entered the mainstream. I think it's very hard to research, And these days, without good evidence-based gold standard research, it's hard to get your treatments on the map and getting funding. More recent trends, the rise of NGOs in the field, the private practitioner, of which I am one, and online telehealth burgeoning, but online treatments where you never get to talk to another person. You're doing your treatments online. Neuropsychology and psychiatry has been huge, particularly in the 1990s. That was considered the decade of the brain. And there's been a lot of research triggered by wars around the world, particularly in the US, huge research dollars going into trauma in the 1990s, which has that as a burgeoning field, trauma-informed therapy. What is most striking to you, looking at the historical context? What I would say in considering it, I think there are strengths and vulnerabilities right across the sweep of history in the field of mental health. There's some ugly stuff we know about from asylums in the 19th century. I'm not in any way saying we need to return to the past, but I am wondering if where we're going is really taking us towards the best nurture possible. And recently I have read the Australian Medical Association saying that there is a problem in the field, that there's no overarching mental health architecture in the system. The systems of care, the tiers of service are very confused. At the same time, there's a burgeoning of professional organisations in mental health. Do you note the significant redirection from nurture in family, communities, schools, churches, to nurture outsourced into doctors and professionals' offices? Some of that may be quite helpful and positive, but think about this redirection. And I think it's a good time to pause. I paused as I was preparing this and thought about what nurture looks like in the Judeo-Christian tradition, a biblical lens. So I looked up a dictionary of Bible themes looking for nurture, and it is full of relational themes in real life. Here they are. The themes, the biblical themes of nurture, by parental instruction, care and example, by the caring attitude and life example of elders, by the caring attitude of fellow believers in community, by appropriate teaching, and by encouraging spiritual growth. Some interesting pause for thought about communities that foster learning and growth from within the communities rather than quickly outsourcing. I am asking a lot of questions tonight with the same theme. Here's another one just to get you thinking. What are the ramifications of moving nurture of human struggles from its family and community context, externalizing human difficulties, a loss of proximity between walking alongside people who are struggling rather than sending them off to a professional. Certainly in my own doctoral research, this was a big theme, and I'll expand on that tomorrow, of how parents have lost their confidence as they've quickly outsourced the treatment of their children to professionals, leaving them at the door or decrying that they're not involved, but parents really struggling out there. And their hope is recovered when they're included in their treatment in a way that generates parental agency and self-efficacy. Are our treatments doing that for parents? Are they doing that for family members and for carers? An interesting little diversion, which will give you some insight into my preparation for these lectures. I could go off on so many interesting tangents, but here was one. I looked at the historical anthropology because I was looking at anxiety historically, and it brought up the history of fear, and it had a statement that caught my attention, that the substantial scholarly literature in this realm recognized the emergence of new fears of death as death became less visible, more often located in hospitals, increasingly removed by doctors and funeral professionals away from family oversight. Is there something parallel happening in our society at the moment in the realm of mental illness and removing and professionalizing and medicalizing? Okay, take a deep breath. We're covering a lot of material here. I'm moving now to considering the efficacy of treatment, a really important area to think about. Although there are many new refinements to treatments, there's substantial research based in science, particularly over the last couple of decades. The literature does raise questions about whether efficacy has improved over time. The literature is there to say that a considerable proportion of particularly child and adolescent, but not exclusively, of patients show improvement without treatment, while a substantial number of patients do not show improvement with treatment. So I'll show you a slide on this from a paper published in November of last year in the Lancet Psychiatry Journal. And there's some very interesting statistics to consider. They don't say that there isn't any efficacy, it just questions the extent of it. Have a look at these stats. 54% of adults show improvement after antidepressant medication, but up to 40% of adults show improvement after a pill placebo in randomized trials. 62% of adults show improvement after psychotherapy, a little bit higher in the stats in CBT therapy. But the shift in the efficacy is shown in this next stat. 43% of adults show improvement in care as usual control groups. And the last point here, 53% of adults with untreated depression show improvements within 12 months. And that is, I remember going to a seminar 20 years ago hearing that stat, which certainly gave me pause. And what is missing from all of the research going on out there in mental health? Well, only 10% of research looks at interventions that don't involve professionals. Think about that. Interventions, the things we were talking about in relation to positive effects of COVID, of the value of stress reduction in work hours, the contextual issues of positive family relationships, access to nature that raises the question of tackling climate change. So there are a variety of ways that people might recover that have been understudied. Again, more pause for thought. So, are there any signs of less professionalizing, less medicalizing in the field of mental health? Are there any indications out there that we are, as a society and in the profession, starting to humanize emotional struggles more than medicalize them? And I want to highlight one that stands out as promising from National Institute of Mental Health Research Domain Criteria. This is shortened to be called the RDoC, released in 2009 and developed further in 2011 to 2012. I know it's very hard to get a sense from this complex but very pretty slide from the RDoC NIMH website. But what this is showing is that the research domain in mental health cannot use diagnostic categories. They don't fit the complexity of the human condition. To understand the full spectrum of mental health and illness, NIMH are saying it is vital to adopt dimensional conceptualizations and move away from arbitrary diagnoses. There's a lot more that could be said about that, but I'm just giving you a taste tonight rather than going into more depth. A quote that stands out for me from the Journal of Nature, it was published back in 2013, but it's worth stopping and listening and taking this on board from a highly reputable journal. Here it is, written by Adam. The problem is that biologists have been unable to find any genetic or neuroscientific evidence to support the breakdown of complex mental disorders into separate diagnostic categories. It's not saying there aren't issues, but is the DSM-5, is the domain of diagnosis serving us well at this point? As I've already proposed, the more we remove nurture from community, the more intimidation people in community will have with fear attached to symptoms. And the more intimidated and anxious we are and quick to outsource, the more helpless dependence on experts is just going to grow out there. And the less family involvement, which is my key area of research interest and concern. So what I'm going to do now, if you're still with me with this very in-depth spread around a whole lot of vantage points on mental health, is I'm going to give us all and remind myself of a back to basics of mental health, a mental health 101, taking away the complexity and just seeing what is essential, what goes across all diagnostic categories out there, and here it is, back to basics. Anxiety. It's a biggie. The fear response to threat is what anxiety is, and just to consider that out of anxiety comes stress, and stress is the fear-activated mobilization of the body's resources to meet a threat. Most of us know that. Stress is activation to fight the threat that comes out of an anxious response. With that, it's a physiological response, the release of cortisol and other stress hormones, and they affect the entire body, not just the brain, the entire physiology. Cognition and mental processes are affected as well. The stress response is so important in understanding emotional unwellness. It's a natural response to mobilize the organism to meet a challenge. For most who are exposed to the stress response, this is really critical to understanding mental illness. The stress response will reset itself to a normal baseline within a period of time. Hear how that fits with the stats on treatment efficacy. That the body has an internal nurturing capacity back to baseline, unless the human imagination takes over. The problem is when this reset doesn't occur. And we have a slide for this one. Our human stress responses are embedded in relationships, and you've all heard of flight and fight and freeze, right? They're the common ones, but I've got some more words, starting with F, to keep it easy to follow, that have all been added to the list of our human stress responses. Please note that these are not just in an individual, they happen in relationship. Getting fractious, the freeze, the flight and the fight we know about, the fretting, and one that I'm especially interested, the fix or the befriend stress response. It's embedded in what's called tend and befriend theory, developed and presented by Shelley Taylor at the University of California. And what she came up with, and her colleagues, is that there is a stress response where oxytocin, the relationship, the bonding hormone, in conjunction with opioids in our system, they join together and they promote affiliative behavior. Think about that there is a stress response that triggers anxious helping of others. Anxious fixing and befriending comes out of a stress response. So we have nurture that comes out of stress, and we have nurture that comes out of calm, and they're very different kinds of nurture. The issue in mental health is when there are persistent levels of tension that lead to all the things that are part of mental unwellness: hypersensitivity, personalization, overreaction, chronic anxiety symptoms. Do you know that NASA, in their screening of astronauts, put them through conditions of isolation, loss of light? I did a check on this, having heard it at a conference, and NASA say that they have to keep secret all of the techniques they use to assess for suitability to go into space, where there are substantial mental health problems. Elon Musk might need to think about that. But they can induce psychosis in the vast majority of people through intense stress. So this just shows that stress and anxiety does equate, in some people more than others, genetics comes into it, into the expression of severe symptoms at times. Dr. Kathleen Smith, in her excellent book published last year called Everything Isn't Terrible, she identified that us human beings have a unique problem because of our brain, and that's called our imagination. What we can do so easily is exaggerate real and factual threats and imagine threats that aren't really there, or we just amplify the threats that are there, and how much of that is swirling around our society, particularly at this time. It's so important to learn in nurturing selves and thinking about how we nurture others to help attend to the threat response, to grow more self-regulation, grow more emotion regulation. It is the core to better mental health. So nurturing the individual, growing a more robust, responsible self. I've done the 101 of mental health, now the 101 of nurture of the individual. Internal capacities for managing fear and stress and strong emotions need to be nurtured in some way, from young children right the way through into old age. There does need to be more growing self up, the name of my book. But this is not growing up self-centeredness. This is growing more self-regulation, growing more self-responsibility. And in the field of psychology, there are a lot of terms for this. In Bowen theory, it's called differentiation of self, which is, in a nutshell, the balance of being in connection with others while also retaining autonomy and being able to be self-directed, and to keep the two in balance. But the other psychological terms that many of you will be familiar with that are out there that say the same thing are psychological autonomy, the importance of developing an internal locus of control, self-efficacy, personal agency, and I'm inviting everyone listening tonight and those who listen later to think about, is the way you respond to people who are struggling, whether you're a professional or a lay person, is it helping the other person develop their own personal agency and efficacy? It's a critical question, I believe. And this cannot happen outside of real life relationships. I do think there is a place for the quiet, calm space of a counsellor's office, or I wouldn't still be in the field doing this work. But if it replaces working on self in real life relationships, I don't think it is doing anyone a real service of nurture. It's a little bit like thinking about exposure therapy for phobias. You understand what's important to learn how to deal with something that you have an irrational fear about. You have to gradually be exposed to it. And if our treatment services are taking people out of their families, labeling family members according to the complaints you bring to an empathic counsellor, labeling them as letting you down and not having given you the love you needed, if that happens, no one is getting good relationship exposure therapy to gradually learning to not be done in by the people in our life so that they can start to become a resource to us and our growth in resilience rather than a problem to us. Starting to bring this together now. The keys to nurturing the individual simplified. This is how I've outlined it in Growing Yourself Up, how to bring your best to all of life's relationships. Drawn a lot from Bowen theory, but I've tried to simplify it and make this theory accessible for people. So here are the 3 categories that I often talk to people about in counselling and in supervision and in training. Function rather than fix, which fits with the RDoc domains of functioning, and I'll talk tomorrow about how it fits with the policy directions in children's mental health and well-being to move more to functioning than labels. I talk to people in counselling sessions about observing their functioning and what's the best functioning they're capable of in their current exhausted state. Everyone can do a little bit better in functioning in the basics of life, from how we prepare our food to going for walks to showering and personal self-care, right up to higher levels of functioning in terms of goal setting, following through on tasks, getting assignments done on time, doing the housework, having rest. All of the aspects of doing life is functioning. Think about discussing functioning rather than fixing symptoms. It takes a different pathway. Being a person and not a patient. Probably don't need to say much about that. It speaks for itself, doesn't it? A human being rather than a patient. A struggling human being. Suffering human being. But a person who is much more than their struggle. And to always treat people this way. And if parents and employers and church workers, and I could go on, are really quick to outsource as soon as distressing symptoms are present, I think we can lose out on treating people as people who have their own capacities to bring their own thinking to solving their life problems. Keeping in contact with others, not cut off. I've already spoken about the problems of avoidance. Our human mechanism that we all share, this is proposed by Bowen, see if you agree with it. The one thing all of us humans do to relieve discomfort is distance and avoid. So to be able to bring back growth and development and learning, we need to reduce distance and avoidance and remain in reasonable contact with people. The more we isolate, the more vulnerable we are, and that fits with all of the pandemic data, doesn't it? So back now to my example of Karen and the course of work with Karen. It has been slow-paced. Sessions are spread out. gradually over time, so that now Karen checks in approximately twice a year. When a new challenge comes up in her life, she might increase her sessions. The work of personal nurture, particularly with people with very complex histories of adversity and challenge, it can never be a quick fix. And remember, we're all on a continuum of our capacities. So there's no quick fix formula. And can us helpers tolerate that? Or does that evoke anxiety? I have worked with Karen and the many Karens of my practice to respect that it's her work of nurture in her real life relationship context. She could only go at the pace that her capacities allowed. I aimed not to work harder than she did. It's one of my mottos for therapy that a member of a team I supervised taught me some years ago, saying, I mustn't work harder than my client is working, keeping it as a partnership. I stayed curious rather than being directive about the descriptions of her interactions, and we explored together how patterns could be opened up that she could learn from to see how she sometimes contributed ineffectively to her current relationship challenges. The domains of her life started to even out rather than this unequal spread of borrowing a lot of self from a workplace that gave her kudos and identity to being able to less invest in success at work and spread her efforts across the domains of her personal life. I think the turning point for Karen was when she shifted from seeing herself as damaged, which after all of her years of intensive treatment, focusing on the adversity and trauma that she had suffered, that was a challenging shift that she had to come to herself. She couldn't be told it. She began to see her capacities for learning to become a good observer of herself and the patterns of doing life for her and for her family members. She began to experience choice about her ways of being in relationship. As a helper and a nurturer, there was a conscious, sustained effort on my part to relate to her abilities, not her disabilities, her abilities to solve her own problems. And this is really hard, particularly for those like myself who gained security and identity through being a helper in my own family, to restrain my helping urges and the tend and befriend stress response is a constant effort on my part. And I would suggest that in the training of mental health professionals, this deserves to be a very important piece of the professional development. I did not want to encourage venting and complaining, which just invites me to triangle and be an ally, rather just to explore how Karen is responding in her descriptions of her interactions in life. So, coming to the end here, I have a slide that distills some of what I've talked about, quotes that I've written into growing yourself up. I've put here my guiding principle that I've already spoken to. I am committed to not taking over and doing for another in my personal or my professional clinical world, to not do what they have the capacity to learn to do a little better for themselves. And I recognize this problem of people giving up their own capacities to solve problems and how important it is to look at that. In summary tonight, is there a mental health crisis? It's complex, really complex, but it's undeniable there's a crisis. It's not a new crisis. Are there approaches and sources of nurture in the family and in community that could be better tapped into? Any nodding heads in my small audience? Yeah. Thumbs raised. Yes, indeed. I've talked about a crisis in confidence amongst the general population, fueled by over a century of medicalising mental struggles, emotional struggles, and professionalising the world. There are pathways back to increased nurture. I hope you've got a sense of them tonight. Pathways that promote agency and resilience and learning as opposed to passivity. And so for helpers thinking about nurture, start with one's own self-regulation and emotion regulation and stress and anxiety management. Reducing the expert stance. I wonder if helpers might consider that. Approaches that invite self-efficacy, whatever theoretical lens people are using out there, I invite you to ask, is the effect of what I'm doing inviting more agency, more differentiation of self from the person I'm assisting? And a key one to finish on is the nurture on offer, valuing and assisting family members to be more of a resource to the recovery and well-being of those they care about most. Thank you very much.
Jenny, you can stand there. Is this microphone on? Thank you, Jenny. That's fantastic. I'll reflect on this a little bit more, but now we move over to our question time. And as I said before, I'm trying to be COVID distant from Jenny, and now you've made me move onto the camera screen, Adela. The link is very simple. It's somewhere, sli.do, and then type in NCL 2021. And questions should come up. And I'm looking at a Word document here for reasons I'm not sure. Oh, here we go. Terrific. It works. Our first question says, could you please clarify the implications of the 2020 research for students seeking help for mental health issues? Should students who are struggling with mental health not seek professional help via their college or university if care as usual without professional treatment is just as effective?
What a great question, and I thank you for it. How do you answer that question? If I have written in the second edition of Growing Yourself Up a section on the kind of help that helps. With it, I've written some questions for people to consider when they're seeing a professional. So I would say that professional help can be enormously useful. If you are struggling, you do not want to struggle alone. But look for professional help that supports you to find your own problem-solving capacities. If your professional help is just agreeing with you that everyone else is causing you problems, then look for somebody else. So be a good consumer of the counselling on offer. And I would think that the counselling on offer in universities and colleges has people who are well equipped to sit and calmly listen well to people. And there's something so valuable just about that, isn't there? So it's a great question to consider. It's a complex one, but I definitely do not want to say tonight, based on the research, that many people get better on their own. The problem with getting through an episode of depression just through the natural course of the body and the mind resetting is that you may not have the opportunity to learn more about your vulnerability to these kind of symptoms and how to manage them and recognize the warning signs. And I think good help can really be valuable in that way.
Thank you. What does self-regulation and improvement in community look like when so many of us aren't medical professionals? What help can untrained people offer safely to those who might be struggling?
Yes, there's a whole new jargon coming through, isn't there, with self-regulation, emotion regulation. So taking the jargon out of it, it is learning to manage strong emotions and impulses, learning to manage not getting our own way, learning to delay gratification, all those things that start with toddlers and go throughout life. So it's clear that parents can help their children develop it by not saying yes too quickly and allowing people to have frequent experiences of stress that isn't overwhelming. We need lots of practice at managing our emotions with separation anxiety, for example. So I hope that gives a bit of a clue to what that looks like in lay language and ways that it can be promoted. Learning how to manage stress using good breathing, some of the great mindfulness and ways of calming self down, ways of using biofeedback through a watch or an app that tells you what your heart rate is. All of those things can be part of the toolkit for individual learning self-regulation.
Thank you. So perhaps this is a little leading question. Do you think everyone would benefit from professional help, or should most people be able to flourish emotionally with a good network of friends and family? Is seeing a psychologist or a counsellor like getting a checkup at the dentist or for your car, or is it more like an emergency care?
Well, you heard my comments on how much emphasis is currently going into acute emergency care, and I don't know that that's a great platform for nurture. I do think that we should be a little more open to considering the nurture available to us without going to see a professional. I think there are a lot of resources that we can tap into. I heard a wonderful presentation at the Family Systems Institute conference last month from one of the Stolen Generation who talked about her recovery of resilience and functioning through the most horrendous experiences of trauma, adversity, separation, and abuse. And she didn't mention mental health professional care at all. The recovery from adversity came through community, through reconnection with family and with culture. So I just put that out as an example of let's look at recovering some of the other resources that are so vital to flourishing in our world.
Thank you for your talk, Jenny! ! I am curious as to your thoughts regarding the origin of this mental health crisis in Western society. Do you think that careerism, higher rates of split families and/or social media are the causes?
I think that there are multiple factors contributing, but many of these factors are also symptoms. What's the directionality of our overuse of social media, for example? The research amongst college students, university students of dependency on social media and the problems of that. And I think of that as not a cause, but the essence of not being able to put boundaries around these anxiety distractions comes from not having enough internal self-efficacy, which is why I'm emphasizing nurture that helps people have more psychological autonomy, if you like, more differentiation, more capacity to say no. Until we grow more internal self, we get caught in obsessional behaviors. So I just put that out there in response to a really interesting question. What I've emphasized tonight is one of the factors that I think is behind our crisis. It's not the only one, but it is the over-medicalization of the field at the expense of other sources of flourishing that we're losing connection with.
Thank you. Dr. Brown, thank you for your lecture tonight. You mentioned at the beginning that relationships are central. Considering the current range of solutions for mental illness, how much does our cultural bias of individualism impact the kinds of solutions that our society focuses on?
Great question. And certainly the human, if you look at mental health treatments over time, there has been a psychologizing of humans, and there has been an individualizing of humans. I think it is a significant factor. I also think that stress, as I said before, drives us to isolate and not keep in good connection and community. So looking at stress levels as it pushes people to be living in their silos and cutting off from people to cope with the pressures of life. And I think we've lost our capacity to deal with difficult people and to be in community together and cope with being disagreed with. And so we isolate and individualize too much. And there's a lot being written about that in social discourse, and it's worth considering. So, good question. A couple of thoughts.
Back in the 1980s, when I worked in community health, there was a large body of evidence showing that a sense of belonging to the broader community is strongly protective against many ills, including heart disease and mental health. Is strengthening community bonds more effective than therapy?
Do you remember I said that there's a problem of not enough research into this kind of question? It's such an important research question for those of you in the field at university looking at research opportunities. I think it's worth searching to see if what's out there in the literature on the value of community over professional support and strengthening communities. I don't think communities can be strengthened by external experts, right? In the same way we've talked about a mental health professional fixing an individual. Communities are strengthened from efficacy and agency growing from within their own people. We've seen that with First Nations communities, how important it is not to be paternalistic. So yes, communities need strengthening, but there are similar kinds of questions to ask about how communities generate their nurture from within.
Thank you. Mental health first aid has become very widespread. We use it here in terms of training our RAs and SRs within the college communities. Where do you think mental health first aid fits into what's going on at the moment?
I have never done a mental first aid course, and I actually don't know what's included in it. I hear about it happening all the time. So I can't answer the question, but I should check it out, shouldn't I? And I should ask the questions of it is what's the effect of mental health first aid in communities? Is it reducing people's intimidation about mental health symptoms? Is it increasing, categorizing people into diagnostic labels? The same questions I've been raising tonight, I would want to ask of the effects of mental health first aid. So you've given me, thank you for that question, some homework to do.
I can see a couple of people in front of me who've done the course, so they might be very happy to engage with you when we finish here. This is a question related to churches specifically. How can churches do better to provide a positive environment for individuals' nurture?
You have to come on Thursday evening to hear that when I'm talking about community. It's a great question, and I do encourage you to look at what I'll be exploring of this question, nurture, in community, in schools and workplaces, and certainly in the church. I hope that you can hear that some of the themes as they relate to nurturing the individual can transfer across to thinking about church groups doing better, not to so quickly compartmentalise those dealing with mental health struggles and sending them off to experts. Yeah, I've got a lot more to say about that in a couple of evenings.
Can you comment on how a collaborative position with a client works in an acute or crisis mental health?
That is such a good question, given the increase in presentations to emergency and acute care services. I think that the most important thing to do, working at emergency frontline in mental health, is to stay calm and to manage one's own physiology. The value of a calm professional who listens, who sits with, who doesn't rush, is incredibly valuable. And that's a version of collaborative coming alongside rather than going into a panic mode, which is very easy to do in those settings. And it's easy for me to say because I have never worked at that level of acuity to fully appreciate what it's like in the shoes of parents, particularly with self-harming adolescents and children, and the ambulance people and the workers who are dealing with it. But I think that acute care services are not the ideal places to do collaborative nurture work in the field. I think they're places of respite rather than treatment. Creating a pause, having a break, not trying to fix. It's not the realm of fixing. It's just a reset needs to occur.
Thank you. Should you prioritise nurturing yourself first over nurturing family members? What type of strategies would you suggest for self-nurture? And how would you differentiate self-nurture and the boundaries from self-centeredness?
Isn't that a great question? It's not an easy one to tease out, but my initial thoughts are that in order to care for others, it is vital to take seriously our own stress levels so that there is a sense of needing to manage self, to self-soothe, to self-regulate in order to be present with others in a way that support can be offered. I think that working on self is about bringing our best to relationships. For me personally, I think there would be a real trap of working on self just in order to have more personal happiness and prosperity and have relationships go well and get everything we dream of. I don't think that's going to deliver anyway, but I think that kind of focus that you see a lot of in the self-help world is not the kind of self-regulation and self-nurture that we're talking about tonight. However, I do think working on self, calming self down, getting enough time to self to reset so that we can engage meaningfully with other people is important and a real offering to relationships.
Hugh Mackay spoke in college last year and would align, some of his comments align very strongly with what you just said. Given that relationships within the family and communities are so central and important for growth, should we be concerned if a teenager is of normal mood and happily enjoying hobbies but has no apparent contact with friends and hasn't made friends since primary school? This is a very specific question.
It is a specific question, and of course I'll be looking more about what can parents do with that kind of a concern when we meet again tomorrow evening. What kind of nurture assists? It doesn't work to try and fix a child and get them to have friends and somehow try and do it externally for them. So thinking about what kind of environment at home or in the school is going to give a child who is inhibited, which can often come from their temperament, but in an environment that is stressful, an inhibited child their happy place will be not with friends but on their own, and there is a real cost to that. So it's just thinking about an environment that takes the pressure out of the social domain so that an inhibited person can feel that it's less risky, it's less intense to engage in friendships and community. Just a few initial thoughts, but a big question that I'll tackle more generally, but specifically to parenting tomorrow.
I said at the beginning that this would prompt some individual reflection. I'm an only child, and anyway, that response is very pertinent. Okay, what questions would you encourage a friend or parent to ask someone struggling with mental health?
To ask what kind of a parent?
What questions would you encourage a friend or a parent?
A friend or a parent.
To ask someone who is struggling with mental health? Maybe what are the first questions they might ask?
Well, I think it is good to consider what you would ask a friend who has just had a medical diagnosis. How you would ask them non-anxiously about, when did you find that out? How are you managing it? Who are you seeing? Just being interested and not anxious, and letting a person tell their own story and say what it's like for them. It's not that complicated if we can get our anxiety about fixing and helping out of the way.
Thank you. This person also said, thanks, Jenny. Are there any statistics on how relationally connected or unconnected persons requesting mental health services are? I think they're asking for comparison between relationally connected or relationally unconnected people. What's the proportion seeking help?
Another good research topic for early career researchers out there in this field, I think. From what I presented tonight, I think back to the protective factors of coping with the pandemic, and certainly having more stable relational connections is a high protective factor from developing mental health symptoms. So one would predict that those who have more connections are going to be less likely to develop mental health symptoms, but it isn't fully protective because of the stresses and strains of life, where mental health conditions are going to be present across all areas of life. But it's a great question to consider. And the loneliness factor, that's another pandemic, the worldwide pandemic of loneliness. Yeah.
Indeed. Thank you. Now, maybe this is a question for tomorrow night, but I'll ask it anyway. How can we as a family form positive relationships alongside families in our school community who see a diagnosis, medical professionals or other external services as the answer to mental health issues?
Well, again, it's the question of what's within our own realm of control and influence, rather than trying to direct and change others, which usually doesn't go too well, and trying to change people, but introducing another way of thinking in a school community, introducing alternative programs, and having compassion for parents. I will talk a lot about this tomorrow, who are really very fearful about mental health vulnerabilities in their children, and you completely understand why they rush off to get professional help very quickly, rather than look at the resources that they've got within their community, within their schools, within their family. I completely understand it, and we're not going to change it by telling people to change. It's about changing the environment from what is within our realm of influence to do.
I promised a pretty hot question time, and we're now approaching the appointed time, so I'm going to announce 3 more questions, and then we're going to give Jenny a bit of a rest. Okay, if research-based treatments are the only kind that will make the mainstream, what do you think the way forward is for making a larger impact with the family system as a model that is much harder to measure? Did you get that?
I did get that. It is a question close to my heart.
I hope it wasn't Dorothy Dixon.
I do think that it's a lot harder to research the more members of a system you are wanting to assess and to observe and gather data on. And so we're missing out on a lot of good evidence base through the particular gold standard protocols of research. I think there's a trend towards more research guided and informed practice, what we can learn from research, but to also draw on other sources in the field. And I'm really pleased to see in the family systems realm that there is more research happening, very creative and dynamic research. And I have the benefit of peer reviewing some of the papers that are coming in this field, and I'm very encouraged by it. It's got a long way to go, but there are new research instruments and domains coming out there for capturing the complexity of the family as a system.
Thank you. Second last question. How can we be loving but firm with those with mental health issues that have learned to be helpless, and therefore that they can excuse inappropriate behaviour by blaming their struggles?
I think that's a system issue, not a blame the helpless individual issue. I think a system is responsible for generating a helplessness and creating a system that allows people to use and validates people using their diagnostic labels as their key descriptor of their struggle. It's a problem, but I think it starts with all of us rather than telling an individual to get their act together. That won't work, and I think it's a rethink of the model and the approach that's needed there.
Thank you. Last question. I think it's really interesting that 100 years ago, counselling was seen as the domain of teachers and clergy, and maybe Bill's going to add in there, perhaps parents as well. And do you think that these professions have lost their focus on nurturing the characters that they teach?
Again, I'm going to touch on that in my third lecture more. And I think the question is raising a good point that doesn't need me to speak too much, that there's something to consider about recovering the capacity to counsel well. Again, I found it interesting tonight looking at the biblical themes of nurture that are not about instructing and lecturing and preaching at people. The themes of nurture in the Bible are about walking alongside, about caring for in community and showing by example of elders showing care, sharing wisdom and living that wisdom. So there's a lot to consider in reclaiming that for sure.
Thank you very much. I'll allow you to step down now. Well, now falls to me to actually revisit what Dr. Brown has shared with us this evening, and I could spend a long time talking about all of the different facets that you've shared with us. But I think in summary, it's been like an incredible bushwalk in which you've taken us to a whole lot of mountaintops so we can look over the landscape from one point of view, down into the valley and then up to the next one so we could have another look from a different perspective, and we really thank you for that. I'm actually going to revisit a conversation I had with an engineering colleague earlier today where he was talking about his parents-in-law who were retirees living in an apartment in Sydney and reporting to him that they'd tried to make friends with the people living in the apartments around them, and people just don't want to get to know each other. I mean, this is common with our lived experience, and tells us about the breakdown of community that's been going on in our society, certainly over 5 decades. But I think singularly, one of the greatest things I've got from what you've shared with us this evening, Dr. Brown, is that we're not specimens in a test tube. We're actually people we're seeking to thrive in a context, and actually putting the context around the individual is where we should be forming our thoughts. It's particularly relevant to college here. So thank you so much for sharing with us this evening your expertise, your breadth of view, and obviously your particular opinions in this space. But we really, really thank you so much for what you've shared with us this evening. It's a bit strange to actually be clapping with such a small audience, but we'll clap nonetheless. In short, thank you everyone for joining us tonight, the few here and the many out there on live stream. Look, just some very, very brief remarks. The New College Communities make the lectures available for free as a service to Australian society. We are a not-for-profit organisation. If you appreciate our lecture this evening, you may wish to help us support the young people that are part of our communities and who will be the part of the next generation of national leaders here in Australia, or even perhaps overseas. You could make a gift to one of our scholarship funds. We're looking to increase our scholarship offerings as lockdown lifts, because people will be coming out of places of stress, and as the university goes back to being face-to-face. You can go to our alumni and supporters page of our website. Any gift that you would like to make will be greatly appreciated. Equally, you might know someone who wants to come to the University of New South Wales next year and would benefit from being part of our communities. If they quote the New College Lectures NCL 2021 to our admissions officer, we'll waive our normal admissions fee. And finally, the New College publishes its own quarterly journal called Case Quarterly. There's been details on the slides that have been shared. This journal attracts contributions on contemporary issues from leading Christian thinkers across the globe. We have special prices on our subscriptions this evening. The link was circulated with your registration, but if you just Google Case Quarterly and contact us, we'll allow you to take up the special subscription price. We will welcome you back as we continue our journey tomorrow night and we consider the nurturing family. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Good night.